It's time for Europe to take point on this. Putin is nowhere near on the place of willing to be ready to do that, I think. We can no longer be reliant on the United States, unfortunately, at least while Trump's in.
Russia is unable to continue prosecuting its war or launch a further invasion after some kind of peace negotiation is in the future to secure Ukraine and thus Europe. Europe can take lessons from what's happening there to prepare itself for defense if Russia should want to expand its war in the future. Because of Donald Trump's push to bring this war to an end, major European national leaders to bring Trump sort of into their collective Western fold. And that's a really shocking thing.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everyone, to part two. I am here with Christopher Miller, Ukraine chief correspondent at the Financial Times. We've been having a fantastic conversation on some of the military and strategic elements. And in this part two, I want to deep dive into those strategic diplomatic angles as well. And we left off with an emphasis on that, we are very, very potentially, and I think, Chris would agree with my emphasis there on the lots of caveats in that peace talks are starting. But the point I always emphasize, as many of you probably know, is just because you begin talks doesn't mean or guarantee anything at all. And Putin is nowhere near on the place of willing to be ready to do that, I think. But, the fact that we're even talking about this, Chris, I think does indicate a shift, a minuscule shift in the Kremlin, perhaps you'd say. But, aside from all of that, forget the talks, forget Trump, because he just gets bored. What does Europe need to do? Because in my mind, they need to step up the most. It's time for Europe to take point on this. We can no longer be reliant on the United States, unfortunately, at least while Trump's in charge. Do you disagree with that sentiment? And if not, then what do you think Europe should be doing more specifically?
No, I agree with you. I think this is a real moment for Europe to step up, and I think that there are some leaders who have shown that they're ready and willing to do that. France's Macron, Germany's new Chancellor Merz. I think Starmer has certainly shown that he wants to play a very active role. He's very close to Zelensky. This is kind of Europe's moment. I think they are the ones who will be key to securing Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty going forward. They can't do it without the US, but what they can do is influence Donald Trump's thinking and what he in the United States, as long as he's in power, are able to and willing to provide to Ukraine in the form of security guarantees to ensure that Russia is unable to continue prosecuting its war or launch a further invasion after some kind of peace negotiation is agreed. Practically speaking, what Europe needs to do is several things, not least of which is to put its own military industrial complexes on overdrive, right? It needs to ramp up production of just about everything: armor, offensive, defensive, military, weaponry, and certainly shells. And some of these things sound like, war machines of the past, but this is a war that is fought using those classic weapons of war. But also what it needs to do is take some lessons from Ukraine and ramp up production and joint production with Ukraine on things like drones. We're seeing the future of warfare be created, designed, tested on the battlefields of Ukraine. Europe can take lessons from what's happening there to prepare itself for defense if Russia should want to expand its war in the future. I think also what it needs to continue doing is sort of what we left off in the first segment of this podcast on, right? Which is clearly define what each nation is willing to do to support Ukraine. So that could be investments in its industrial production, joint production of weaponry. It can be also saying, we're going to provide air support as part of our security guarantee, or we're going to be able to provide boots on the ground as far as what we're able to do for that security guarantee. It needs to very clearly define these things to get Donald Trump on their side, and to also get him to really lay out in detail, which he's not great with, what the US is going to do as part of its role in security guarantee. So I think Europe's role right now is getting Trump on their side and understanding the war from their perspective, but trying to peel him away from Vladimir Putin, working
But
more
Chris, if
closely
I
with
can
the
just
Ukrainians. Sure.
pick you up on one point, because obviously one of the challenges about Europe is it isn't a monolith. There are
Correct.
40 or whatever, 35, 40 states in the continent, 32, whatever, in NATO, and not all of them agree. We've got Slovakia, we've got Hungary, I mean, Turkey, if you want to put it in the context of NATO. There is varying degrees of support for Ukraine. And even though, say, pick Italy, right? Meloni has made it very clear that she's not a traditional populist, or in that she is very staunchly supporting of Ukraine. But, at the same time, there have been concessions or exemptions rather made regarding, say, sanctions, right? The Italians have, the EU, when they imposed sanctions, the 18th round were delayed. And even then there are certain exemptions certain countries get so they can continue to engage Russia in certain ways. The Austrians, last year began bringing back in more gas than they had before the full-scale war began. So how confident are you that this can come to life? Because as much as I like to believe in Europe, the reality is it's not always that honky-dory, right?
I agree. No, it's tricky. It's tricky. It's not a monolith, and you do have these nations, a couple of which you mentioned Hungary and Slovakia, which act as sort of spoilers in all of this, right? But I think there is a moment right now, if seized upon quickly, can get a coalition of Europe's biggest, most powerful militarized nations on board with providing guarantees to Ukraine in the form of security guarantees, but also deals made with them and the United States for the purchase of American military equipment, joint production projects with Ukraine or with each other. That in this moment over the next let's say 6 to 8 months, right? I think a lot of progress can be made on that front, even without Hungary and Slovakia. Now there might be other things like Ukraine's entry into the EU, right? That is going to be trickier politically because of those nations and them having a veto over that decision. But I think there is this moment right now because, I suppose largely, because of Donald Trump's push to bring this war to an end, that people are talking more now about how to bring it to an end. And I think, there are some European leaders who are showing that they may have grown a slightly stiffer, stronger spine in all of this and see this opportunity now to bring it to an end. I'm not saying that it's going to. I think I've been pretty clear that I'm not particularly optimistic, but this is a good moment, I think, for everyone to have really intense, detailed talks about how they can press Russia to get to a point where Russia's then forced to sit down and talk. But I don't think we're there yet, but this is a moment of, I think, organizing, planning, saying very clearly what you're capable of and willing to do in the future to secure Ukraine and thus Europe, right? I think that's what this is about, European security. If you look at it from this sort of bigger perspective and make it less about ending the war in Ukraine and more about ending war in Europe, then I see a lot of countries, including Italy and others, who want that to happen and have potentially the ability to have a real say in it because of their either influence over other nations across Europe or relationship with Donald Trump. Maybe that's slightly an evasive answer, but
no, there'll be some members of the audience who I'm sure who it pains them to hear that because they obviously want it to be about doing it for Ukraine's sake, but there are going to be more, should we say, realist type politicians and leaders who sort of see this from the greater emphasis of Europe as a collective. Again, though, my concern is that there's a lot of austerity. There's a lot of emphasis on lack of growth in Europe. In Britain, for example, where I've been based more recently, there's so much emphasis on migration challenges, on domestic issues. And so there's a sort of emphasis that if we're going to do this, if we're going to continue to support Ukraine, which obviously a large proportion, not the majority of the British public, and most publics, I think, across Europe, are in favor of doing so, it has to be done differently. And what I mean by that is that the correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be a bit of a shift in emphasis that it's not just about giving financial aid to Ukraine now, but more about military support, which means that there's a reverse beneficial process in that it builds up industry in the UK, in France, and Germany. Is that sort of, because therefore you've got a mutually beneficial process for the Ukrainians? They're getting in-house development, advancement of tech, but also it's revitalizing and modernizing industries in other parts of Europe. Is that sort of the sentiment of people you've spoken to?
I think so. Look, I mean, Donald Trump has sort of shifted the way in which Ukraine is being provided assistance, right? It's no longer, and to use Trump words, it's no longer handouts, right? The Americans are not going to provide beyond what is being provided under previous agreements during the Biden administration. It's not going to provide military assistance. So it has become already more transactional. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, so long as the Europeans are still able to purchase arms and weaponry and ammunition from the Americans for Ukraine. And so far, we've seen, Donald Trump be open to that and even start agreeing to sales of military aid, of military equipment to the Europeans to then provide to the Ukrainians. I think if that remains open and he sees it, him being Trump, sees this as something that can be mutually beneficial, helping Ukraine in its defense of its country, while also building up production capacity here, securing jobs in both blue and but especially his base red states. That's a positive thing. Just as you said, also this means that production is going to have to ramp up in Europe, and I think that is a good thing as well. It's not. If early on in the full scale invasion, right, it was about the sort of moral, ethical duties of us in the West and Europe to help Ukraine. I think 3.5 years on, while that still exists, I think for some people they're looking for other reasons to continue supporting Ukraine. And if it's this sort of idea that, okay, it needs to be more mutually beneficial, economically speaking, then so be it. I think the Ukrainians have done a fairly good job of convincing their European counterparts that they can do this together, that Ukraine does have capacity if it had, greater financing or help from other countries, and it has ramped up joint production with some European countries, producing military equipment in Ukraine and on the European or the EU side of the border as well. So, this sort of narrative shift isn't necessarily a negative. But I do think that it is one that it's now here, and I think it's good to to address it head on. And these are deals that can be made if if that's what it takes. With Trump, right, to get him on board and show that Europe is not also providing handouts, but that it wants, or it sees this as something that's economically mutually beneficial.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, whilst you are the chief correspondent on Ukraine, you're in the US. As someone who engages the Ukrainians about American sentiments, right? What is your opinion about Trump's approach to this? To me, some of my audience are detesting of him. I like to always retain, maybe it's my British hopeless optimism or something, but I like to hold on to a sliver of hope that maybe Trump is more inclined to support Ukraine now. In the past 6 months, he vacillates all the time. 1 minute it's this, the other time it's Putin, flip-flopping, right? But now it does seem to be that he is more seemingly settled on, let's support Ukraine, minimal effort, maximum benefit, or at least what we can for the United States, no more handouts. But it does seem like he's more on board with this at this point versus, say, 4 or 5 months ago when he was like, no, let's stop it, guys, pro-Putin. Or you don't think it's like that?
It's a low bar. I mean, there has been a shift, but look where we came from, right? A hugely disastrous meeting in the Oval Office that led to, a brief but still pretty scary pause in military assistance and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, right? That showed that he was willing to make it painful for Ukraine to get Ukraine on board with his idea of how the war should end. I think the Ukrainians are cautiously optimistic about Donald Trump, and certainly this last White House visit went much better than the first. Zelensky has gotten some coaching from Starmer and Macron about how to deal with Donald Trump, and I think he's he's done some listening, and certainly this time around there was a much better rapport between Trump and Zelensky himself, on camera, and I heard even behind the scenes as well. They they bonded over several things, and the note that Zelensky brought from his wife, the First Lady of Ukraine, Elena Zelenska, that was addressed to Melania Trump about her efforts to help secure the return of abducted Ukrainian children. I heard that Donald Trump was very appreciative of this, and so Zelensky has made strides in strengthening his relationship with Donald Trump. But there's history there. It goes back to 2019 when Zelensky was was a part of the reason why Donald Trump was impeached the first time around, right, over his dealings with Ukraine and the fallout from their quote unquote perfect phone call. These things Donald Trump hasn't forgotten. He also, as I mentioned earlier, has this bizarre affinity for Vladimir Putin. And I think when it comes down to it, he doesn't want to sit across the table and end a war with Ukraine with Ukraine's Zelensky by his side. I think he wants to sit across from somebody he believes is another great world leader and global superpower, on par or maybe just a step below the United States, right? And carve up the world. I really think that this is how he views the end of this war. Not with him and Zelensky signing something, or even perhaps, the three of them, the other being Vladimir Putin, but I think something along the lines of a one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin where they sign away whatever it is to end the war is how he would prefer it. And so for Ukraine, this is something that is very much at the forefront of their minds. They're very worried about that, and keeping Donald Trump on their side is a full-time job because, just as you mentioned, he vacillates. Right? I mean, just a few months ago, he was still, speaking very critically of Ukraine, and now he's speaking rather positively. But he can also, meet Putin in Alaska and suddenly roll out the red carpet, have a flyover with B-2 bombers and fighter jets, and smile and laugh with Putin and invite him into his limousine and crack jokes, and then not really have the same sort of and celebratory, kind of mood when he invites Zelensky to the White House. And even if we did see them smiling, it was a tense moment. Zelensky brought reinforcements in the form of several European leaders who were there to help manage the meeting, to make sure it didn't get out of hand like the first one did, but also to try to get Donald Trump on their side. I mean, that should show you just how difficult of a task that is, that it takes several major European national leaders to bring Trump sort of into their collective Western fold. And that's a really shocking thing to say, considering that, America is an adversary, or should be an adversary of Russia, right? Or rather, Russia is an adversary of the United States. And the United States is a key, the most important ally of Ukraine and the European Union. And yet there is this concern that he could be lost to Vladimir Putin and Russia. And so it's a huge task and never-ending job to try to keep Donald Trump on their side. And I feel like the situation is so fragile that it wouldn't take a whole lot for, this new sort of structure that's been created over the past weeks and months to come crumbling down. If Donald Trump, hears something he doesn't want to hear from Zelensky, or here's something he would like to hear from Putin, or this war drags on, for much longer. He's an impatient person who doesn't like details. His view of this and bringing it to an end really is at this sort of 30,000 or even 50,000 foot height. He doesn't want to get into the nitty gritty. Now he's come around to Putin's side that there shouldn't be a ceasefire and then a lasting peace negotiated, right? He wants to see it all ended in one big fell swoop. And that's dangerous because it's what Russia wants. And any kind of big deal like that at the moment is likely to benefit Russia more than it would Ukraine.
Certainly. And, my two last questions, one of them, it's very much related to this because I think clearly Trump has a idealization of Putin. He wants to see himself as sort of this, version of a strong man, the guy who's been able to centralize power and sort of create the country in his image to a certain extent, and glorification, if you like. But at the same time, someone was telling me in an interview I had with them that, Russia and America were friends at some point. They coexisted. The selling of Alaska is an illustration of that, and deliberate choosing of that as a way to try to appease or just please Putin is sort of, again, the red carpet, the soldiers, the American servicemen doing these actions is not something that you see. But that being said, Zelensky's comments about you wearing the same suit to the very deliberately picked, was it Fox journalist, right? Brilliantly played by Zelensky. His acting skills, his performative skills coming out there very well, I think. And, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, but also because you live in Ukraine, or you're based in Ukraine often. And so the intrinsic relationship of Russians to Ukrainians historically is something that I think it's impossible for Trump to fully understand, and why Putin is seemingly as obsessed with Ukraine as he is, right? I don't know if you have any thoughts on those points, right? There isn't really a question. Well, I just want your reaction.
Yeah. No, I'll give you. Okay, so there was this post that Donald Trump published a week or so ago on Truth Social, his Twitter analog, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, but it's close enough. He said, if I freed Moscow and Leningrad, the media would still say that I failed, right, and would criticize me. And it says a lot about his thinking and where he is at, mentioning Leningrad, which hasn't existed as a city since the Soviet Union. And I quipped, actually, I think we would give you credit if you freed Leningrad, considering that would be pretty remarkable to pull it out of the past and to set it free, right? But Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, is, Russia's second city to the north of Moscow. But the fact that he couldn't, did not know that, apparently, perhaps, or understand that Leningrad no longer existed, or had been renamed and had not existed for more than 30 years, just suggests to me, and there are other things as well, that Donald Trump is stuck in the past. He has this idea of Russia still as a global superpower, when we know that its GDP is the same as some of our biggest states here in the US, right? The one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world, but it's no longer a global superpower. But he still has in his mind that Russia is the Soviet Union and that it has the power and influence that it did during the Cold War. Again, it goes back to him wanting to divide up the world with who he believes to be the second most powerful person in the world, just behind him, right? And that's actually not Russia. I mean, that might be China, but it's certainly not Russia. But that's the mindset that he has. So when he views Ukraine through that lens, through the same lens, it is Ukraine as a sort of vassal state, not as this independent democracy that it's become over the last 34 years of independence, today being the 34th Independence Day of Ukraine. He sees it as this sort of pesky borderland state that exists only in Europe's periphery and certainly far from the forefront of his mind, which is why I think it's a huge task for Ukraine to prove to Donald Trump that it is important, that is important for the United States, that it's important for Europe, that it's a crucial piece of European and global security, and that it is deserving of his support. That is a task that is never over, and one that I certainly don't envy of President Zelensky having to do. And I know that myself and other Western journalists, we may at various points have been critical of Volodymyr Zelensky and some of the decisions that he's made, specifically on the domestic front. But I think his intentions are certainly good, and he is actually rather good on his feet, just, with the sort of remarks that you mentioned, being humorous and light and kind of, helping to create this more lightened mood in the Oval Office this time around. He's very good at that. And I think he has proven himself, not always, but more often than not, I think, to be a good diplomat for his country. I think he can be very persuasive with world leaders and explaining to them why it's important to support Ukraine. I think he's managed to do that in recent months with Donald Trump. Early on, I think he came in a bit overconfident. And I remember last year ahead of the US elections, Zelensky's team telling me behind closed doors, we've been really frustrated with the Biden administration and we're so tired of what they felt like was this sort of drip of military support that allowed them to continue fighting, but not to win the war outright. Right. And they wanted a real chance. And they thought with Donald Trump, while he's extremely unpredictable, that unpredictability could also work in their favor. And, sort of this idea of with great risks could come great rewards. And, the failure in the Oval Office the first time around, in which Zelensky was ambushed by J.D. Vance and Trump, I think was a serious dose of reality for many in Kyiv who I think were naive to think that Donald Trump would be so easy to win over. They understand that that's a really difficult task. And again, it's a process, it's ongoing, but certainly they need to keep him on side. And, to go back to Trump himself, I do think he's sort of stuck in this, idea that Ukraine does have to prove itself. Russia is this great big superpower, and his mindset is stuck in this sort of like 40 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to speak with you, Chris, about Ukraine, and yet somehow Donald J. Trump has somehow wormed his way into a center point of our conversation.
Well, he always does. This is the Trump effect, to suck all the oxygen out of the room, and exactly.
Well, unfortunately you're closer to him than I am, so I'm not jealous of you on that front. But my very last question to you, my friend, is this has been a wide-ranging conversation, and obviously there's a lot of retrospection here about what could have happened or the reasons behind, and maybe we can have you back to talk about some of that in the future. But very simply, what would you encourage the viewers, listeners, readers of yours to look out for the rest of this year? Are we going to see more military movement, or are we going to see a sort of coinciding diplomatic flurry of activity, predominantly in Europe, whilst the military aspect grinds on and the Ukrainians try to, minimize the Russian advances, or it will change in the winter with, general winter?
So diplomatically, efforts will only ramp up to try to bring Donald Trump more onto the Ukrainian and European side to really understand the war from their perspective. The Europeans, with the Trump administration, and the Ukrainians will be trying to solidify what each is going to be able to provide in the way of security guarantees that would come into play when there's an end to this war after negotiations. Russia, in the meantime, on the battlefield, will continue its military operations. It will likely ramp up its aerial bombardments of Ukrainian cities, especially going into winter. We're coming into heating season just a couple of months away, and Ukraine is working to fortify its defenses around critical infrastructure. So ahead of winter and several cold months, we're likely to see Russia ramp up its missile and drone attacks to put more pressure on Ukraine. Also, again, as I mentioned earlier, to try to convince Donald Trump that it's futile to continue supporting Ukraine, for Ukraine to defend itself, and that it's winning the war, right? So that's the narrative we're going to hear. And that narrative is going to come with an increase in attacks, I think. The ground assaults and offensive will continue through the drier autumn months. Once it gets cold and rainy in November, I expect that to slow down, but then that's when the airstrikes will probably increase. Ukraine still is facing and will continue to face a serious manpower problem. It's not able to recruit enough soldiers for its fight, and the forced mobilization of men being taken off the streets in many cases is something that is deeply unpopular in the country. And so they're going to have to come up with some kind of better way to get people to new recruits, new soldiers to sign up for the fight. That's going to be another major challenge. I think all of that is going to happen against, again, this backdrop of a flurry of diplomacy. But really, we're at the beginning of these types of talks about peace talks, not at the end. And so there's going to be months of this. And I think for the Ukrainians, it might even be one of these cases where things get worse before they get better. And so it's going to be a tough year. We're not seeing the end of this thing. If anything, we're at the beginning of the very, very beginning of the end. But that's where we're at.
Yeah, no, for sure. Talks about peace talks, the way I will be framing it from now on, I think, but equally, in many ways, unfortunately, right now, exercise is in futility, but this conversation certainly wasn't. Christopher Miller, Ukraine chief correspondent for the Financial Times, thank you very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. I do hope to have you back later on, perhaps in the fall, or, whenever works in your schedule. We'll have to see, but it's been an absolute pleasure. And for those of you watching, listening, thank you very much. Do subscribe or give the video a like, and we'll see you all next time. And happy Independence Day to Ukraine. Take care, everyone.